And we're joined now by the Liberal Democrat Business Secretary, Vince Cable. Welcome. I think this is the first time we've seen you during this campaign.
Last week.
Yes.
Was it?
The second.
Your memory's faded.
Who are you again? Just wanted to check. Now, you want to see public sector pay rising at least in line with inflation. But public sector pay is currently rising by 1%. Inflation's rising by 0.2%. So if we go your way, they'll get a smaller pay rise.
Well, it depends what inflation is. As you know, the Bank of England has a 2% objective.
Not until 2020, so at the moment it's 0.2.
Yes, we'd envisage the real value of public sector pay being maintained. After all, the public sector's been through some very, very deep cuts, and we want to maintain the real value.
Sure, but as I say, if you now go to peg it to inflation and inflation stays low, I mean, at the moment it's zero. Projections in the OBR show it only going up to 0.2%, maybe 1% a year later. Your proposal would actually result in public sector workers getting a smaller pay rise.
Well, we're talking about 16, 17, 17, 18. We don't know what the inflation outlook will be in a year's time. We just want to make sure that the public sector pay review bodies, and talking here about teachers, nurses, the police, are in a framework where they don't face continued real cuts.
Well, the OBR's forecasting inflation of just 1.2% in 16-17.
Sure.
And that could be an overestimate. So if they peg it to, if you peg it to the OBR forecast, if that turns out to be true, this will be worth precisely 0.2% to public sector workers.
Well, if that is the assumption that's carried forward a year's time, that may well be the case. But I think the expectation is that inflation will rise. But
Really?
the promise we're making, is that there won't be further real cuts, and that's
right. But they're not having real. There have been real cuts. I understand that, but not now. With public sector pay rising at 1% and inflation at 0, they're not getting real cuts at the moment. So there's no change from what you...
Well, it is maintaining stability, and it's partly about providing a guarantee to public sector workers they don't face real cuts. It's also providing a framework for the spending review. The proposals we have are neutral, actually, in public spending.
So it's not all it's dressed up to be by Nick Clegg.
It's not massive largesse for people in public sector. We don't pretend that.
But that's the way Mr. Clegg was saying to Joko this morning. It seemed to be a big change in policy.
No, it's not a big change of policy. It's anchoring public sector pay in a sensible place. And it's in marked contrast with the Tories, who haven't said anything about it, but I think people expect quite deep cuts. I don't know where the Labour Party are. They've been very vague about all of this.
Well, you've still got to find £12 billion worth of departmental cuts. And a lot of the previous departmental cuts were funded by a pay freeze in the public sector. So you can't do that now because you say it's going to rise, not by very much, but it is. So where are you going to get the 12 billion?
Well, we've said that, amongst other things, we've got to get productivity gains. The public sector's productivity has been generally low. We've got to improve that. But actually, with an economy growing at 2.5%, 3%, which is what's expected, if you get, for example, flat cash settlements in main departments, you're making a significant contribution to reducing the deficit. So, as you know, we've emphasised in our approach to the public sector deficit, I think roughly 45% comes from increased tax. The other comes from the spending side.
So it's a bit of a wing and a prayer then, isn't it? You haven't really got any idea of where you would make the cuts.
Well, they have to be negotiated. We've set a general ballpark figure.
Give us an idea.
Well, you've just said the figure yourself, which is about 12 billion.
Yeah, no, give me an idea of a cut that would contribute to the 12 billion.
Well, in my department, I've cut spending by 25% in the last 5 years. We cut overhead by 40%. We know that there is potential scope for considerably increased efficiency in some of the organisations we oversee, like universities. They could operate in a more efficient way, and we would want to make sure those reforms are carried through.
Bit vague.
We've been doing it. As I said, we've made big...
But maybe you've got the low-hanging fruit by now, as you will know.
I think that is a fair point, actually. That a lot of it will be very, very difficult as we go forward, but the economy is growing now, so that the impact of cuts is much less severe than it was at the beginning of the last Parliament.
Are these public sector pay rises, such as they are, were they in Danny Alexander's alternative budget projections?
As far as I know, they were. Yeah.
Didn't you check before you announced them?
I'm pretty certain they were. They're certainly consistent with it because they represent neither an increase in spending commitment nor a reduction. They're neutral, actually.
Really? How can you pay people more than the rate of inflation and it be neutral?
Well, the commitment is to pay people at the rate of inflation. I mean, there will be
but afterwards, you say, I think I'm right, for the first couple of years.
After 17,
right.
the argument is as the economy grows in real terms,
the public sector will get a bigger chunk.
Able to get some
Understand.
benefit.
But is that in Danny's projections to 2020?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Are we sure?
I'm pretty certain. Yeah.
Pretty certain.
I'm not sure how that's neutral on public spending either. It maintains real pay, but surely it's a cost to the public service employers who are paying that.
Yes, it is. In nominal terms, it is a cost, but in terms of the assumptions that are made in the OBR, that is already factored in, as I understand.
Now, one of the things that you've said and others have said, including your former government colleague Jeremy Brown, is that although freezing and in real terms cutting public sector pay, because it has fallen in real terms under the coalition, has been that it saved a lot more jobs in the public sector. So if you're now going to pay more than inflation, will that cost jobs?
Well, it's changing the labour market conditions. I mean, we're at the moment, we're getting a position where there are severe bottlenecks. It's actually quite difficult to recruit key public sector people.
Really?
Indeed, in certain key areas, and some of the agencies I'm responsible for, we're having to authorise selective pay increases to recruit people. So it's a very different environment from the one we inherited, where you've got large-scale unemployment, and the main objective is to keep people into work.
Jeremy Brown told this programme, if we don't have public sector pay restraint, we can only pay for higher salaries by sacking people. Is that right?
I think that's right. And so the proposal that Nick Clegg announced this morning, although it is providing reassurance to people in the public sector, it does involve significant restraint and continued restraint, and that must be the case.
But you're going to increase health spending by $8 billion. You're going to increase education spending in real terms too. We were now going to see a rise, particularly in the outer years, of public sector pay as well. But you're still going to balance the current deficit by 17-18. Is that credible?
Well, a significant contribution, unlike the Conservatives, is made from taxation. And as you've seen, we're wanting to take action, for example, on corporation tax. The banks currently get special relief, dealing with loss provisions, dealing with anomalies like interest relief, substantial amount of revenue.
How much would come from that?
We're talking, I think, 3 or 4 billion from from the corporate sector, even while maintaining the basic rate. And I think, in addition to that, sort of capital gains tax, we've made proposals for tightening up on relief.
But you were the one behind increasing capital gains tax to 28%, and since we've increased it to that level, it brings in less money.
Well, I think that the two things are not necessarily correlated. We've been through a very difficult stage in the economy.
Well, hold on. Corporate earnings are at record levels, and we're still paying. We're still getting less in on corporate gains tax than we did before when it was lower.
Well, the justification for having the higher capital gains tax rate was, for example, with second homes, which were treated in a very generous way, and it was absolutely right that we tax them in the way that we do.
Well, except there's hardly any point in raising a tax if it brings in less money.
But I think you're making a jump from assuming that the revenue is directly related to the rate of tax, and I would question the logic of that.
Can I ask you a broader question? If Labour ends up the largest party and they approach you to come to some kind of agreement, maybe even a coalition agreement similar to the one you have with the Tories at the moment, but it requires still SNP support to get to the 323 votes or above, would you be open to that?
We've rejected the idea of working with the SNP because their underlying objective is to break up the UK, so we've rejected that. Oh,
so you wouldn't even come to an informal agreement with
them? We've ruled out coming to agreement with the SNP, as we have with UKIP. I mean, they have an agenda breaking up our relationship with Europe. Right. It's symmetrical with our attitude towards the SNP.
Now, that's interesting, because if Labour did come to you for some help, and my sense is that if the Scottish Labour Party gets almost wiped out, they'll be so angry with the SNP, they'd rather deal with you than they would with the SNP. But if they want to deal with you, they cannot then deal with the SNP as well.
Well, it would be very difficult. I think they'd be very unwise to actually.
But you would say you can deal with us, but we're not dealing with the SNP.
Well, government doesn't quite look like that. But we've made it very clear that we wouldn't be entering into a relationship with the SNP. I think it would be a very dangerous thing to do. I think it would be a very dangerous thing for the Labour Party to do. And we have, one of the big themes that's emerging this election are the dangers on the two extremes. I mean, we get the Labour SNP potential link-up, which a lot of people are genuinely frightened of. And on the other side, you have UKIP, the Paisleyites, and the 30, 40, 50, 60
what have you got against
Tory
people from
MPs
Paisley?
are
What have you got
equally
against
dangerous.
people from Paisley?
Not the
What have you got against people from Paisley?
Sorry.
Oh, these Paisleyites.
Those Paisley.
Oh, I see. That's very different from my Paisleyites. I know you've been floating this business of the kind of the blue kip, as you call it. Is that a real? That's a real danger on the right of the DUP. I mean, UKIP will probably only have
UKIP as such, as you're quite right, will probably have 1 or 2 MPs.
Yeah.
The real problem is the problem John Major had, which is what he called the bastards, and I think that he had 15 of them, potentially
that word yesterday on
50
this
or
programme?
60 next time round, who frankly despise David Cameron, want him out, will make life hell for him. And I think not enough focus is being placed on the instability we get on that side of the spectrum.
Yeah, well, it could be we get instability, whatever the minority
Well,
government
that's
is
why
on
it's
the right or the
important to have
centre.
a moderate, large, stable bloc of Liberal Democrats. We can anchor British politics
I knew you were
in the
going to
centre ground.
We've got Vince Cable being more statesmanlike than the Prime Minister in emphasising the requirement to keep the Union together, when the Prime Minister, even some of his own senior big beasts have suggested, is demeaning himself by actually putting the Union into political advantage.
Just final question to you while Vince Cable's still here. If Labour is in a minority situation, and at the moment the polls suggest, the bookies think, that Labour will be the largest party come May the 8th. We don't know. People will decide, but that's what it looks like at the moment. Who would you rather deal with, or who would you advise Mr Miliband to deal with? Mr Cable and the Lib Dems, or the SNP?
Look, I think you know what I'm going to say, Andrew.
You're working
it's
for a majority.
crackers if you're out on the doorstep, and I'm sure Vince
but you're
doesn't
not.
do this
You're here
either,
on the Daily Politics.
But I am sometimes on the doorstep.
No, but you're not
And I
now.
would not advise people. If you start talking about the deals that you're going to be doing after May the 7th,
No, I'm not talking about the
it's
deal. I'm
not-
just saying,
well,
who would you
you're-
rather? No,
you're
who would you rather
asking me-
deal with?
You are asking me to speculate about something that's going to happen after people have cast their votes.
just-
Before they've cast them, it makes it look to people like you're not actually listening to what they've got to say, and you're not interested in selling
Everything
your
we
own
discuss
programme.
in this programme is hypothetical in the sense it's about what you would do after the election. So why is that a kind of persona non grata question?
Well, what I would like to see Labour do after the election is, obviously I'd like to see them in a majority. If they're not, I'd like them to propose a Queen's speech, setting out the things they've been talking to people on the doorstep about, and invite other people to support it.
All right, well, it was worth a try. Vince Cable,
That's
thank
a
you very
pretty
much.
straight answer.
Come back and see us. Don't leave it so long.
I will.
Well, as I say, he was on
Forward
last
to it.
week.
Well, it just seems longer.
Yes, so much fun we're having. Now, in one of the slightly more surprising turns,